Welcome to another edition of Inspired Stories, where leaders share their experiences so we can learn from their successes, how they've overcome adversity, and explore current challenges they're facing.
Welcome to another edition of the Inspired Stories podcast, where leaders share their experiences so we can learn from their successes and be inspired by how they've overcome adversity. My name is Anthony Codispoti, and today's guest is Mathew King, founder of King Strategy, a fractional CFO agency that serves both for-profit and nonprofit entities. Mathew has over 25 years of experience across several industries, including services, manufacturing, construction, real estate management, social services, mortgage lending, and healthcare. Before we get into the good stuff, today's episode is brought to you by my company, Add Back Benefits Agency, where we offer very specific and unique employee benefits that are both great for your team and fiscally optimized for your bottom line. One recent client was able to add over $900 per employee per year to their bottom line by implementing one of our proprietary programs. Results vary for each company, and some organizations may not be eligible. To find out if your company qualifies, contact us today at addbackbenefitsagency.com. Now, back to our guest today, the founder of King Strategy. Mathew, I appreciate you making the time to share your story today.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here.
So, Mathew, tell us simply in your own words, what does King Strategy do?
It's fractional CFO. So it's anything you think a CFO would do at a fractional level. So you've got companies who they need a high-level oversight. They may have a controller or a finance manager, but they don't have the budget for a full-time CFO. Or if they hire a CFO and they don't pay enough, they're not going to get the right result. And so there's a certain size that fits for nonprofits, and then there's a certain size that fits for for-profits before you do want to hire a full-time, higher level resource. And so that's where I fit in.
And what are those thresholds in both for-profit and nonprofit? What's sort of like the minimum size company that makes sense for a fractional, and then where's sort of the threshold where it makes sense to bring that talent in-house?
Yeah, so for-profit, it could be anywhere up to 6, 7, 8 million, depending if it's services. Now, if it's product related and they're selling it'll be higher. Now, for profit, it could be anywhere up to.
And sorry, Mathew, that 6, 7, 8 million, that's the threshold that they want to bring it in-house?
That's probably the threshold where they're getting big enough where they need to bring it in-house because they need more than what a fractional can offer.
And what would be the minimum size?
There's no
revenue?
minimum.
No minimum.
Okay. So I've got a client that's under $1 million and some that's $6 million, and it depends on where they're falling short. And they may just have an interim need where they need some process cleaned up, or they grew from nothing and now they're at $500,000 and they're a mess. And so it's anywhere up to that. You could probably stretch to 10 if they're selling a product, right? Which means your revenue is going to bump up quicker.
Got it. And then how do those numbers look for the nonprofit space?
That was nonprofit.
Oh, that was nonprofit.
Yeah.
Okay. And then
so for profit, you probably get up to, for services, 40, 50 million. Now, if you're selling a product, and it's higher than that depending on what the product sells for, right? So, you might have a professional services company and they're selling an hourly rate, right? Whether it's an attorney or whatever. And so now if they're selling a product worth $10,000 instead of $500 an hour, then that revenue can get up higher. But 40 to 50 million for a services company, then at that point, they're probably ready for like a full-time resource, depending on how they're sort of trending.
And why do those numbers look so different for-profit versus nonprofit, those thresholds?
It's a good question. For-profit, when every hour that they put into something, they're not selling an hourly rate, right? So an architect sells an hourly rate. So they've got their salary, all their staff, whereas a nonprofit has salary and their staff, but their money comes from fundraising, government grants. And so they're not then turning around. They're basically giving their services for free. So their revenue is always going to be lower. So you'll have a $10 million nonprofit. That's a really good sized nonprofit. It's probably somewhere equivalent to a $40 million for-profit.
In terms of employee numbers?
Employee numbers and volume and headache.
Okay. So talk me through the path that led you to starting a fractional CFO company, because I've got a copy of your CV, your resume here in front of me, and I can see that you kind of started out, the entry level staff accountant, slowly worked your way up the accounting ladder,
Yeah.
had a couple of longer term CFO type positions that each lasted about 8 years. What led you to kind of break off on your own and offer fractional services?
Yeah. And I'd always wanted to have a business, and I didn't know what it was, even when I was first starting out. But specifically this, another CFO, my stint in nonprofits, I was CFO at Austin Habitat, and another CFO at another nonprofit. He went out about 4 or 5 years ago, and he started his own fractional CFO consulting group. And we reached a couple of years ago, he reached out and said, hey, would you have interest in doing a bit of work on the side? And at this point, I was full-time at a physician practice. And I said, no, not really. And then he reached back out a couple of months later and he said, man, I'm in trouble. There's a client going south. I could really use your help. And so I was like, all right. And I got in there and I instantly regretted it.
Why?
I was
It
busy.
was just a mess?
Yeah, they were. But I've got 2 young kids. I had a job. I've got their sport. I just had enough going on. So I got in there, and within a couple of months, I was like, all right, now I've got it under wraps. I can see, I know where things are, and I don't have to feel like I'm fumbling in the dark. And then I got to the point where I was like, I like this. This is kind of good. And I had registered an LLC for consulting work about 6 years prior. I had done nothing with it. So I was like, why was I complaining about trying this? This is what I've been wanting to do. So anyway, that project ended, and a couple months later, same guy hit me up with a couple more. And so I did 2 more on the side. And then earlier this year, really the final push was, so I'd been with a physician practice for about 7.5 years. We got bought out by a much larger group about 2 years ago. And so my regional CFO role got eliminated early this year at the beginning of February. And so I'm looking around and I'm thinking, well, do I go for another full-time role, or do I try and do this full-time? And so, I reached out through all the avenues, reached out to all the CFO fractional groups and recruiters for full-time, and just decided I'm going to give the fractional role, give it a shot. And so far it looks like it's working out. And it's great. The big push was, I don't want to go back to an office. I like having different clients. I like the flexibility. So yeah, so far
you get to work from home, set your schedule. You got more flexibility with this. You feel like a little bit more of your own boss, as opposed to reporting to somebody else as their CFO full time.
Absolutely. Now my mindset is different. Whereas once you're an employee and you turned up and you go chill out in the kitchen and talk to a coworker and make a coffee, and it's like, well, that's not billable time anymore. So I am focused on, I put in networking time in a week, and frankly, this being one of those. But how I look at a day is different now. So there's a different motivation, and I was always a hard worker and always made sure things got done and created value, but it's just a different mindset.
And so what does some of that other networking look like? You mentioned this podcast is a step in that direction. What other kinds of things do you do to get yourself out there?
Yeah, nonprofit is what really showed me networking. So there's a really strong networking group here in Austin, and showed me the value of it. Prior to that, when I was in for-profit, you don't tell anybody what you're doing, because I can't tell you what our financials are or what our revenue is, because it was all secret, right? But it felt secret, but in nonprofits, it's not. So as I was getting out of there, I realized I had no network in for-profit. So I joined a local group, FEI, Austin. So it's financial executives, it's controllers and CFOs. And so as soon as I joined, I signed up for their program. So I did their programs for a couple of years. So every month you got to find a speaker. And So it was great. I got to go out and meet with business owners and people and say, hey, this is what we're trying to do. Would you be interested in speaking? This is what we'd like to hear. What would you like to say? So I did that for a couple of years. Then I was president of the group and then stayed on the board for a couple of years. So I still attend the meetings, but not on the board. Now with fractional work, I've got a business develop, right? So I've got them out there. I've got a develop business. So I'm joining, there's a Association for Corporate Growth. And I think they've got chapters also around the country. And so I've just started going there. I knew of them, but I really didn't have a need when I was a CFO of a company before. So join that group, and then there's another group that I'll probably get to as well. So they're breakfast meetings, lunch meetings, some evening meetings. So once or twice a month is the rotation of those.
And when you're at these meetings, you're meeting other people who are sort of in the financial world, and so some leads opportunities come available from that?
They do. It's never been my focus. So at FEI, it was really just networking with other CFOs. And then, of course, the vendors, which are the sponsors, and the vendors, often they bring more value than your fellow CFO does, right? Because you need to get insurance in place, or, we had the COVID crisis, our PPP loan wasn't coming through, so I had to use my other channels to get it. So there's definitely value from that, but now I'm looking for a different value. So the Association for Corporate Growth, it's all vendors. You might run into another CFO there. Like I'm a CFO, but I'm a fractional. It's my business now. But that's the sort of place where I think business will develop. And I spoke to somebody in my network this week, actually, and they've given me a lead on another group that I'll probably look into as well.
That's terrific.
Yeah.
So that's where most of your clients have come from, just sort of being at these different networking events and letting people know that you're around, you've got this skill and expertise, and you're available.
Yeah, right now it's come from that one, my network who was a CFO at a nonprofit, and he's got his own group. That's where most of it's come from. But as they're coming up, and they say, hey, they'll reach out to somebody who was once doing it, and they're like, well, I'm not doing that now, but I know Matt is. And so I've had a lead that way. I had a call yesterday, and they just found me on LinkedIn. I'm still trying to work out what search they did to find me, because they're not here in Austin, but their HR is in San Antonio. So it's a variety of things. But having a strong network from just years of, once somebody knows you, you get to trust them, right? And so you don't really need to vet them anymore.
And so do most of your client engagements sort of have like a predefined period, or are they just sort of like ongoing because they just regularly need your services sort of in perpetuity?
It's both.
Both situations.
Yeah, I've had two that have been going for a couple of years, and one I do more operational things for them than the traditional CFO. I do some CFO work, but they're ongoing. I'm about to start one that's 3 months. It's fixed. It'll end at the end of August. But ideally, I'm looking for a couple of anchors, right? 1 or 2 anchor clients that they're at that 40 million threshold. They want steady growth. They're not looking to double and triple and go PE. So I'll be there for a while. So as long as I've got 1 to 2 anchor clients, then I can take the interim, the 3 month here and the 3 month there, because they're really hard to put jigsaw puzzles together.
And that kind of leads into my next question, is sort of describing what would be your ideal client. Any other sort of criteria that checks boxes that are a good fit for you?
In terms outside of the personnel fit, getting along and making sure we're going to be a fit with each other, services, I think anything along the services. I've not really done anything in tech. Is probably one thing I haven't touched. So depending on what it is, it could still be a fit. It just depends on what niche experience is potentially needed.
Got it. What do you feel separates you from other fractional CFOs? Somebody's going to hire you versus another fractional. Why are they choosing you?
Well, as soon as once you get past skill set, right? Because every industry is different. And sometimes they think it's different and it's not. A lot of nonprofits make that mistake. They need a nonprofit person, and I didn't once do nonprofits, but I joined a nonprofit and did well, right? So sometimes it's perspective, but sometimes there is a real skill set that's needed. So once you get past that, I'm just pretty straightforward to work with, very honest, hardworking, but I think probably mostly I'm pretty calm. So if something hits the fan, I'll be the one that's the calmer. I'll have more perspective, and then vice versa. So we've had some successes at companies, and people were, jumping around, but I wasn't. I just really just try to stay even keeled. For the CFO role, I think it's pretty critical not to sort of jump up and down and sort of jump from one end to the spectrum. So
Now, usually that's the role of the business owner to do that.
it is the role of the business owner. It's the role of sales and business development. So yeah, that's right.
You need to be the cooler head in the room.
I do, and it's not who I am necessarily outside of work, but I have to be at work.
You wear a good mask when you're at work.
Yeah.
Mathew, what's an interesting fact that most people wouldn't know about you?
Well, there's a couple. So I started off, I actually left school in year 10 and did refrigeration and air conditioning for about 6 years.
And so you say year 10. So we can tell by your accent, you're not native to the U.S. Where are you from originally?
Sydney.
Sydney. Okay, so year 10 would be the equivalent of 10th grade, sophomore year of high school.
That's right.
Okay,
that's
right. So you left early to go into refrigeration.
Yeah, so I chose a trade, and so I think they now encourage you to go to year 12, even if you're going to be a tradesperson. So I left in year 10, did my trade, had my trade license, don't use it, won't use it again. And so about when I was 20, so about 4 years in, I just had a lot of sporting injuries. And I was like, I can't be hobbling around at 40 years old. I'm already hobbling around. And so at that point, I was like, well, what do? I liked math at school. And I thought every company needs an accountant. And so that's kind of really how it started. And you have to think.
That feels like a big jump.
It was a big jump.
You left school early. You got into the trades.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I get the part where okay, my body is not holding up to this really well. But to go from trades, into math and accounting work feels like a big jump. But
it was a big jump. And I flip-flopped once because I didn't feel right. But this is 28 years ago. We didn't have a computer, like right now you've got a smartphone and computers. We all know how to do anything. I had to go to school at night to learn how to touch type, to learn how to use Word and Excel. So the goal was I was going to get a job at a company big enough that had a big accounting department. So I could just push my way in there. It couldn't be 5 or 6 people, right? It had to be 20, 30, 40 people where I could just get in there. But so I used my customer service experience to do that. But I needed to learn how to use a computer first. So I did that at night for a couple of years. Then I got into a finance company. It's a division of the Bank of Scotland, and worked hours where I could go and work in the accounting department for free in the morning, and just annoyed the person that they sat me next to. He hated it that I was there. But then when a job opened up in the accounting department, so I did about 6 or 12 months in taking loans, just basically in a call center. I got a job in the financial accounting team ahead of 3 or 4 other people in that same accounting department. Now, my boss that hired me, he regretted it because he realized I didn't know what I was doing. But I just had to be a little bit hungrier. And so I just had to work hard. So when I got into it, to your point, I didn't know if I was going to I didn't know how good I was going to be. And so, but I knew I could outwork the person next to me. So if there's somebody sitting next to me, I could work harder than them. And by default, I'd learn quicker, right? So, but before I got to that point, I was still in the call center. I did flip-flop. I was like, I don't think I can do this. So I went and took a sales job in a place that sold compressors to the air conditioning industry. And then I went there, and 3 months in, I was like, nah, this is not the right thing. And I had a lot of young people that I was working with back at the finance company. I was having a lot of fun there. And at this new place was just older people. And I was like, I need to go back. So anyway, so I flip-flopped back, and then the journey just kept on in the same trajectory.
Okay, so a couple of things I want to unpack there. So you were still doing refrigeration, and you said, I'm going to go to night school on top of that.
Mm-hmm.
And you're how old at this point?
20.
20. So this is a time when most of your friends are probably going out at night, hanging out, chasing girls,
Yes.
slogging back some beers. And you're kind of missing out on a lot of that because you're dedicating yourself to learning how to use a computer and, learn to type and, sort of lay that foundation. Must have been hard.
Yeah, it was. But, it was manageable. The harder thing was when I finally got into the accounting program, that was all at night. I didn't do it through the day. And so that was even more so. That was tougher. So I just had to wait till the weekend. And I had a lot of study to do, but I still had a little bit of time on the weekends. But yes, it was just needed though.
And what was this part you mentioned that you worked for free in one of the accounting programs? How did that come to be?
Yeah. So we serviced all of Australia, and so it was a finance division of the Bank of Scotland, but it was based in Sydney. So we serviced all of Australia, and so I chose the 11 to 8 shift every day that I could. So that covers Perth, right? There's a 3-hour time difference in Perth. So you 8 o'clock in Sydney is 5 o'clock in Perth. So I did the 11 to 8 shift. So the first 3 hours, I asked my supervisor, I said, can you ask the accounting team, can I work down there? I want to get into accounting at some point. And so they sat me next to this poor kid, and I just watched how little he did every day for 3 hours.
Did you learn much from watching that lack of activity?
Not a thing. But that wasn't the goal. The goal was just to show that I was interested in when an opportunity came up.
Got it.
Yeah.
And so where does this drive come from? You said, hey, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have the experience, but I knew that I could outwork the guy next to me. Where does that come from?
I'm not sure. I knew I had to make a living and I needed to earn money, and I knew I was behind the 8 ball, right? So I signed up for school when everybody was getting out of school. And so I was like, geez, if I'm going to do this now, I've got to work harder. And so it was just by default. And so I think it's a little bit about upbringing, I suppose, Anthony.
Your parents were hard workers.
Yeah.
They instilled that work ethic in you.
Yeah. And I saw my grandfather as well. He would go to work and do his job, and he'd come home and fix the house up, and he was always busy doing stuff, and he was always working. So it just seemed like that's what you do.
So you were close with your parents, your grandparents, but at some point you decided to leave home. How was it that you ended up here in the States?
Yeah, that's so I stayed at the finance group for about 3 years, and accounting work when you're starting off at that level is exceedingly boring. And so I was looking for the next opportunity. And like I said, I was behind the 8 ball, so I had to be really aggressive. So I got lucky with an opportunity that a lot of recruiters weren't putting me forward through to. And so I was able to get hired directly, and it was at Christian Dior. So it was the Sydney office for the parfums division. So we service parfums for Australia. Fashion and jewelry was in Melbourne, but so at Christian Dior, and at Christian Dior, it's a international company. So we had a lot of people doing their working visa there. I worked with 3 or 4 girls from Ireland, a French guy, a couple of English guys. And so I stayed there for about 1.5 years, and I just contracted the bug at that point. They were doing so it's all part of the Commonwealth. So you can sign up for a working visa with certain countries, and you can be gone for 1 year or in some countries 2 years. And I saw how much fun they were having. And I was like, I'm out of here. And so I need to do this before I settle down with kids and a family. And that was it. And so I was at Christian Dior for about 1.5 years, and I signed up. So that first year was January through December, and then I decided, so beginning of January the next year, I signed up as soon as the program opened, because all the visas get taken by about March. So signed up, and then by June, I was finishing off a couple of subjects of my accounting program, and that was the impetus to leave at that point. So I was waiting for a semester to end, and then I was out of there.
So you met your wife before or after you left Australia?
In Europe, and she's from Texas. So yeah, so I signed up. So I did a working visa in Canada, and I thought, well, let me do a trip before then. So I did a 37-day bus ride through Western Europe, and it's a big thing in Australia and New Zealand. It's a New Zealand-born company. It's called Kentucky, and so it's not as well known here in the States. But she did it with a girlfriend of hers. So there was a handful of Americans and Canadians on this trip, but predominantly Australian and New Zealanders. So it's 50 people on this bus for 37 days, and you're all young. You can't be over 35 on this bus. And so you party a lot, you get to know each other very well. And so she was on that bus. So we got to know each other well. And after that, I went to Ireland. I visited the people that I worked with at Christian Dior and hung out with them for a few weeks. And I stopped in Austin on the way to Toronto for a few weeks.
It's really not on the way, but okay.
No, it wasn't exactly on the way. But she called me in Dublin, and
you had motivation. You had a reason to be there.
Yeah, she said, "Why don't you stop on the way?" And I was like, "Well, I don't really have a lot of money left." And she said, "Well, do you want to see me or not?" And I was like, "Well, I guess I want to see you." So I went to Toronto, and it was going to be there for a year, and then we said 9 months, then 6 months, then after 3 months, we're like, "Let me move down to Austin because I can't sleep at night because you keep calling, my family keep calling, and I'm dying here." So anyway, I moved down to Austin, and I've been here for 21 years.
Right, this is home now, huh?
Yeah, this is home.
Yeah, interesting to hear about the bus experience across Europe. I had the opportunity to do the backpacking thing in college in Europe as well, and the number of Australians and New Zealanders that I met who were not only doing the same thing, but were doing it for extended periods of time. Like it seemed like a common thing to just take a year off and I'm just going to go and walk about.
It's crazy. Yeah. I had some friends that they did a year, and they did backpack and hostel, and I wasn't as brave as that. I signed up for a working visa so I could get a job and pay for a place to live. So, but yeah,
it's a much more comfortable way to do it.
It was. You still had to work at it, but it was easier.
Yeah. Mathew, I'm curious, is business leaders, and particularly, CFOs, who are helping companies drive EBITDA, one of our many jobs is to help find ways to increase profitability in the company. I'm curious if there's anything interesting that comes to mind that you've tried in the past as either a way to lower costs or, help boost sales for a company.
Yeah. Yeah, gosh, I mean, every place you start. So I'll start with the most recent, that was the physician practice. So when I got there, first thing I did was you study the transactions, right? I want to make sure the financials are good before I start projecting off. So I want to make sure the base is good before I project off something that's not good. But I started just studying the transactions and putting reports together. And what I noticed was, and it was a family physician group. So you go to a doctor, right? And sometimes it might be just a cough and a cold. Sometimes you might have something, you're a little bit more sick, and they code that visit based on the complexity. And so I ran this report, and I went to my boss, who was one of the owners of the company, half-time provider, physician, half-time administrator. And I said, does it make sense that we had like 50 providers. So does it make sense that half of them are coding 30% 214s, 99214s, and the other half are coding 70%? they're all doing the same thing when it flushes out over a year. And he said, no, that doesn't make sense. And so I put together a model and showed them the revenue that we were foregoing by doing that. And for, a $20 odd million company, I showed them that we were at least 750,000 foregone to $1.5 million.
Wow.
And so what the next thing we did was I found on paper, one of the physicians, one of the owners, who was a good coder. And it turns out he was actually a technically good coder. And so we put together a coding program for all of the providers. So he and I went around and we trained each of the providers on, hey, these are the things you want to be doing, and just kind of dumbed down and simplified that process, because it can get complicated, right? And it can weigh the provider down. They're like, gosh, did I spend 20 minutes? Was it 25? And did I do this? And so we really just simplified how you can think about it. But a lot of it
Some
was
sort of a decision matrix that you created for them?
Exactly right. And a lot of it was just their mental, like, it's just easier to do a 213 than it is to think about having to write down 214. I'm like, well, let's stop that, right? Because you do that for 1,000 people in a year, that's a big impact to you and your compensation, but it's not for them. They're coming in once or twice a year. It makes very little difference to them. But if you're not earning market compensation, what's the long-term viability of this organization if we can't do that? And so a lot of it was changing behavior. So we did the training program, which helped, but then I still had to work with a couple of physicians, and I would meet with them monthly and just really walk them through what it takes to do it. And sometimes it was simple as have a Post-it note. At the end of the day, write down how many 3s and how many 4s you did and send it to me on an email. Do that for the next 2 weeks. Because they would tell me, well, I feel like I did a lot. I was like, well, here's the report. You didn't. And so let's come up with a way where we can give you instant feedback. And it was simple as putting it on a piece of paper at the end of the day. So that was probably one of the biggest things, was just changing how they produce revenue.
What made you look for or even notice that opportunity in the first place? How did that hit your radar?
It's just what you do. As a CFO, you come in and you study the business, and you look at, so we had 11 business owners, but we had 15 business units effectively. And so we had 15 P&Ls that I ran within the one P&L, but it was really just whether it's 15 P&Ls or different product lines, you run the profitability to see, well, why is this product line profiting and this one's not? And as if there's an explanation, that's great. And if there's not, then you've got to dig further. And in this instance, there was not. So we dug further. I was like, well, why is this P&L profitable? They're producing the same volume. They're seeing the same amount of patients. And so then it's just a matter of digging in. So you just studying the transactions and you just study the business.
Was it challenging to sort of coach doctors through this? Were you running into some ego pushback, or were they really receptive to what you were trying to do?
It's funny you say that. So when I took on the gig, I was like, all right, I'm going to know in the first 3 months if this is going to work out working with physicians. But I got in there and there were a couple of this was one of them, but we also did some outsourcing of our IT. So I think I earned their trust pretty quick. And that helped. Now, if that didn't happen and I just walked around and met with them, they'd kind of look at me sideways, waiting for me to stop talking so they could just go about their day. But they saw the value that I was providing, so they actually listened. So once it's building trust was the big thing, really just showing them, hey, this is the value and this is why we need to create this value. And they were all business owners. They were like, some of them were like, why am I not earning as much as this and as this? I was like, well, here's why, and here's what we do. And so they saw the value.
So it certainly helped that not only was the company's earnings being affected by this, but their own individual pockets were being affected by the behavior. So they had real motivation to get on board.
That's right. Yeah. They did.
Mathew, any specific books, mentors, training groups, experiences that have been formidable and helpful in your career trajectory?
I don't read a lot of leadership books. I've tried it and I don't like them. So
Fair enough.
I like Harvard Business Review. I like snippets. I like to read a page or two of a business story, then get to the point and then see the conclusion. So that's what I do, and that I get to inspiration from that, right? It's like it could be a human resource, or it could be starting at a business. Like, what did they do? What did they overcome? I don't want to read 300 pages to get there. I read novels, so when I read a novel. But in terms of learning, every job that I've had, I got there and I looked at my boss, and as soon as I thought that I could do a better job than they were doing, I knew it was time to get out of there.
Mhm.
But I learned. I didn't go in there with a critical eye and say, well, they did it. That was a terrible decision. I just got to the point where I was like, I think I would have handled that differently, and I'm comfortable with the process that they're doing. And that's when I went to the next job. So where I really learned and where I got some really good mentoring was when I went to Austin Habitat. At that point, I was the head of finance and my boss was the CEO. And so I got there when firstly I was like, not sure if I'm allowed to swear in this podcast, but I said, dang, there's not a finance person that I can rely on anymore. I am the finance person. Everybody's looking to me. So that was one adjustment. But then I was looking to the CEO when I realized he was not a good business person. He was a good relationship builder, which for a nonprofit was what he needed to be.
Mhm.
Great at business development, but I didn't realize he was a terrible business person. So I relied on him originally until I realized I couldn't. But I learned from him, man, how to build a relationship, how to get buy-in from the staff, and then how to develop business and things I'd never really thought about. And we had a big business decision that we implemented in the first year that I got there. And I was younger and I was just ready to just get it done, right? Let's just get in, let's implement it. And he's like, well, we need to bring in the staff. We need to lay out what we're doing and why we're doing it. We need to get the buy-in. And for me, I was frustrated by that. I was like, well, we know this needs to get done, but at the end of the road, when it got done, and it was the right thing. And so I learned from that.
So what were some more of those sort of big takeaways, the big learnings from building relationships, how to develop a business? What are some other key lessons that you held on to?
Be patient. Don't, and I still am a little impatient at times, but rely. So if you've got something and you need to do change, you need to get buy-in from the staff. So change management's a real thing. You don't just go and do it in a silo and then tell everybody this is what we're doing, because whether they think it's needed or not, they're frustrated by that, and they're going to be your nemesis now, right? Instead of your advocate, because you didn't bring them into the fold.
Mm-hmm.
So change management is a huge thing. Just building rapport. So getting in. So now I'm, when you go get a new job, right? You're like, the first 3 months are going to be terrible because I've got to build rapport. I've got to build trust again. And
nobody knows how awesome you are.
Nobody knows how awesome I am, right? And so it can be a long road. And so now I'm doing that constantly with new clients as a fractional role. And so you just, could I have done this 5-10 years ago? I don't know, right? Because I've got to come in and build rapport really quickly. I am humble, but you can't be arrogant. You can't come in and just boss people around. And arrogance can never be there anyway. But when you've got a shorter runway, it's even more so important, right? Because there's no period where you can get forgiveness, right? Because that project may have ended. Hmm. So just learning how to build rapport, build trust. the CEO at Habitat, when we met with donors, or even if it was the banker, he just sat there and listened. And he always had this thing where he had his fingers together. But
I'm picturing Mr. Burns from The Simpsons.
It was. But he was just very patient and listened. And then when he spoke, it was generally very thoughtful. And so, you read books and they say, listen more than you talk. And most people don't, but you do need to. And so, because you may not have your thought, properly developed yet, and they may have something better to say than you do. And so anyway, learn a lot from that. And then really I just observe anybody who I'm working with, any conversation that I'm interacting with or observing. I'm just watching how they're handling that conversation. Was it, and there's things that it's not going to be authentic for me. So I don't use what they may have used that was successful, but I'll try and take snippets away.
Mathew, share with us what your tech stack looks like. What kind of software tools are you using to help you run your business and serve your clients?
Yeah, and that's evolving. So one client, for the longest time, it's just been, for an accountant, it's your accounting software and Excel, right? And so Excel is still, I'll write a Word document in Excel, right? So Excel is what I use. But
you're a lot more comfortable if it fits into a grid, however big that prose may be.
I'll put it to print screen so I can make sure it fits onto a page. But no, so, as you get bigger, you might need a budgeting tool that's bigger than Excel. But for most of the companies I work with, it's not generally needed until you get to really large scale companies. But one client I'm working with, they're using Asana. It's ASANA, and it's just a
project management tool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I was annoyed at first. I was like, dang, it's something else I've got to learn. But now I love it. And so I have a weekly call with this group, and he sent me an email and we had a call, and I said, hey, you haven't put that into Asana. So now I'm telling them to get it into Asana. But it's fantastic.
You're a believer now.
I am a believer. You go there and all your projects are there. All the latest updates are there. And I don't use it to its fullest extent by any means. In fact, I'm not even sure yet how to set up a new client without the old client seeing it. That's research I've got to do. But it's fantastic.
Yeah.
And so there'll be other things I think that are going to come up just like that.
Are you using any kind of instant messaging tools with your clients, or not broached that yet?
No. One client likes to message on Microsoft Teams. I must admit, I don't think I'm as good at adhering to that for them. But that's also the group we're on with Asana. And so I think we've got enough cadence and enough communication. But they do a lot of instant messaging in their internal team. It seems how they communicate. I had one group I worked with years and years ago, and they IM'd. And I was like, great, so now I've got a telephone, I've got the computer email, I've got IM. I was like, what do I answer?
Everything all at once.
But there's a use for them all.
Yeah. Mathew, what's something you wish you could teach the 20-year-old version of yourself? Something you know now that's pretty familiar and obvious to you that would have been helpful to know when you were younger.
Gosh, so when I'm sitting on my back deck, that's when I reflect. I take the time to reflect on how was the week just gone, what's coming up next week. But then I also think about the last 20 years and the last 30 years. And I don't know that I'd change a lot. I think one big thing that I've had is I've been lazy with some interactions, right? I've had an interaction at work, and maybe I think I was just probably a little bit too bossy and didn't listen enough. And I looked back and I was like, man, I did not handle that well. And then a year later, I looked back at another conversation. I said, I still did not handle that very well. So I'm trying to get better at making sure and I think I am, like the change management thing I was talking about, when I see something that needs to get done and I know it's the right thing, it may not be exactly the right thing, but I feel like it's the right thing, right? So I'm into it. I think I'm getting better at just making sure it's the right thing before I really push it down people's throat. And not being
making sure it's the right thing for the other party as well.
Making sure it's the right
mutually beneficial.
That's right. And that's the thing about having a meeting, right? When you have a meeting, everybody should walk away from there with taking something away. And it's the same with that. It should be mutually beneficial. And I think I haven't handled that well in the past.
Gotcha. Mathew, what are some things, some passions, some interests that you have outside of work?
So when I moved here to Austin, it was 2003, and you have to remember, it's not like it is now. I didn't even have a mobile phone, let alone a smartphone, right? Nobody had a smartphone. We didn't know what that was. I did buy a laptop, but you couldn't have that. You didn't have access to everything you do now, right? So now I can stream Australian rules football back home and rugby league back home, and rugby league is my main sport. And we're in season now, and so that's what I do when I'm sitting on the back deck. But I was homesick. I didn't have access to that. And so I was here in Austin. The first 3 months, I didn't even have my visa. I didn't have my temporary visa in yet, so I was doing nothing. I was just riding around Austin, learning, just riding the streets. And I remember some old Hispanic guy who was obviously retired thought that I was just not working, not at school, and called me a bum one day. I was like, I'm not. But, because of being homesick, I was looking for something to connect with other Australians. And so I found there was an Australian rules football league in the States. And there was once a team in Austin for a couple of years. They're actually, while I was here, but they'd fallen away before I looked them up. And they never really got big. So anyway, I reached out to them, and a guy responded who played on the team when they were a team. And he said, no, they're not around anymore. And so I kicked that off. So we went and kicked the ball around a little bit. And I never played this sport in Australia. I didn't even watch the game till I was 19, because Sydney's a rugby league town. Melbourne's an Australian rules football town. But there wasn't a rugby league team. There's rugby union, which is different. I didn't want to play rugby.
You're really confusing all the American listeners.
I know it.
They're like, I thought it was just all rugby. What's the difference here?
No, so rugby league is very similar code to rugby union, but some different intricacies. And I'm not a huge union fan unless it's the World Cup. So Australian rules football is very different. It's a big oval field. It's like 2-3 times bigger than American football field, 2 to 3 times bigger than a soccer field. So when we rent a field here in Austin, we rent 3 or 4 fields and run diagonally, 3 or 4 soccer fields. So it's 18 a side. So it's a lot of running. You get to avoid contact. It's still contact, but it's not like, it's like World War II, right? There's a bit of strategy, whereas World War I, you just charge them. To see how you go, just charge that line and see what happens. So there was an Australian rules football team, and at one point I was like, you know what, I'm going to get this thing back off the ground. And so started that in earnest in late 2005, and I nearly quit it a couple of times because it's very hard. The economy, the town is not like it is now. So there weren't many Australians around. The economy wasn't as big, so that brings people from all over the country and the world. So we've got that now. But in 2008, there was an Aussie here at a local college on a tennis scholarship, and he bought out a few guys, and we kind of doubled, and from there we grew momentum. So I started an Australian rules football team and really kicked off. We had our first national. So that every year there's a team in any major city you're in. So what city are you in, Anthony?
I'm in Columbus, Ohio.
There's a Columbus team.
Okay.
And we've actually played national tournaments in Racine, in Columbus. I've been up there numerous times.
So wait, you were a guy that left the refrigeration industry because you were worried about it being hard on your body, but now many years later, you're getting involved in a pretty aggressive sport and starting up a team and sort of reigniting the league. That's
yes,
great.
I'm sore. My lower back, I live in pain. But no, and so I did have to. The last few years, so I stopped playing when I was 40. So I'm 48 now. So I stopped about 8 years ago. But the last 3 years of playing, my life was icing, stretching, and watching kids outside of work. So I came home and I watched them and change their diapers while I was stretching and icing my body. But yes, so we started a team, and now in Austin we have won Division One. I think it's like 8 Division One titles, and so in the last 10 years.
Wow.
And so
it's a dynasty.
It is, and we built it from a mentality where we couldn't turn anybody away because we couldn't afford to.
Yeah.
And so some teams would, and this came down to, and I got a lot of growth from doing this. I did things like developed people. I had to go out and develop sponsors. So I learned things that then I could put into my professional career. And so we had a philosophy where if you turned up and you wanted to play, then you played. Now we expected something from you, and you had to work 100%. And if you didn't work 100%, we would talk with you about it. And if you didn't fit in and you treated people and you were arrogant and you didn't bring the right personality, I would pull you aside and say, hey, this isn't working out. This is what we need from you. And so we would, anybody who came, now we loved it if they had athletic ability. It was a gold mine, and we would date them and do whatever we needed to keep them. But it didn't matter if they didn't. If they turned up, but we had an expectation of them. And that has just continued on. So the guys that have taken it over are guys that I brought on and I worked with when I was still there, and they're keeping it going, and it's amazing.
Are they mostly Aussies who play, or are there any Americans or other nationalities that show an interest?
So to grow the game in America, when you play, half the team has got to be American. Half the team on that field has to be American. So, and they did that because there was a team that had their share of Australians, and then they had a bunch of Irish, and then the Gaelic sport is very similar. So they had these Irish and Australians, and they were just demolishing teams, and it wasn't growing. It wasn't growing it in their town with the locals, right? And so I was like, all right, half the team has got to be American, not Australian, and you got your American citizenship. You've got to be American.
And how do you prove that? You make them talk out loud for a while, see if their accent slips through.
We had one guy who was born in Egypt. He's American. His father is Egyptian. He was born there for 2 weeks, and they moved to America. So his birth certificate says born in Egypt, so he didn't qualify as American. And we had too many. We made him kick a ball, and he was a terrible athlete. We made him kick a ball.
You put him in the American bucket then.
We made him kick a ball in front of the select and said, look, he's American. Just kick the ball. And he's like, all right, we'll put him down as American. But you have to have your birth certificate.
Okay. Yeah. All right. There is some verification.
There is. Yeah.
Now, have you warmed up to any of the American sports since you've been here?
I played baseball for 3 years as a young teen. So I love baseball, and I've been coaching my son's baseball since kindergarten. He's 12. Then I moved on to basketball, and so that was my main passion was basketball. So I love basketball. I watched American football in Sydney back when the Bills couldn't win a Super Bowl. Do you remember that?
I do.
So Dolphins were my team. And then I stopped watching it for a long time. I just got tired of the delays in the game and the showboating. But this year, my son wanted me to start watching a few games. So I started watching it, and I love it again.
So who's your NFL team? Who do you guys follow?
By default, from all those years back, it's the Dolphins.
It's still the Dolphins. Okay.
And I just liked the color of their uniform. So I was like, I'm supporting them. But yeah, I enjoyed it. So there was an American expat who used to show a game every Tuesday night. And and I had a little fuzzy black and white color TV it was, and I couldn't even see the players properly. But no, so I started watching that again.
So you got into the Dolphins because of their uniform colors, but you were watching on a black and white television.
Well, I had a color as well. It may have as well have been black and white. It was not very good.
And then who's your NBA team?
The Spurs by default, because they're the closest. So we had some good years.
Yeah. So you were during the Admiral, David Robinson, and Tim Duncan. Is that when you were following?
So I grew up playing basketball when Michael Jordan was playing.
Okay.
So that was when I was playing as a teen. I was a huge Knicks fan. I liked Mason and all the guys that played on the Knicks. I still love watching some of the replays on YouTube. But, I didn't really have a team when I was back then. I liked the Hornets because I liked Alonzo Mourning. He just looked like the kind of guy I wanted to be. Yeah.
Yeah, he was stacked.
He was stacked.
Yeah.
I'm still trying to get there. But so the Spurs, and then the next is any Texas team. So any Texas team I support. So I'm an Astros fan, Mavs fan, Rockets fan. But I like players too. I like watching some players. I enjoyed watching Chris Paul. I like
CP3.
Loved watching him play.
Yeah. He's a great ball handler. Mathew, just have one more question for you, but before I ask it, I want to do two things. First, I want to invite people, if you enjoyed today's content, hit the like, share, or subscribe button on your favorite podcast app. The second thing I want to do is point people to the best way to get in touch with you. Is that through your website, kingstrategy.com? Is that LinkedIn? What's the best way for people to reach out to you?
Yeah, kingstrategy.com is a good one. The LinkedIn profile, my email, am I allowed to say it?
Absolutely.
It's kingmat75@gmail.com. So just KINGMAT, just one T. So one T in Mathew. And from there, if you're looking for, fractional help, I'd love to touch base and see if I can help. May not be a fit, may be a fit. It's just,
and if it's not, you networked really well, you may be able to point them in the right direction.
And I have done. Yeah.
Great. So last question for you, Mathew. How do you see your industry and maybe more specifically your business evolving in the next 5 years? What are the big changes that you see coming?
Yeah. I think we're going to see, for nonprofits, it's pretty safe. They're not going to get bought out by private equity, right? So, but everything else is. And so, 7.5 years at a physician practice, and they were staunch, the owners, of not being bought by a hospital system. We went to market before being bought by this large family group in Florida, and we got an offer from a large hospital system, and they just didn't. It's not what they wanted to do to their patients. Costs go up, and so the environment's changing. And so you looked around, and you probably, everyone listening, you have an animal, and you go to a vet. Vet clinics were getting bought up by PE, pain clinics, dermatology. So I was seeing that because I was in the physician industry, but it's happening everywhere, right? So they're very smaller groups are just becoming less and less. So it just depends on what the owners want to do. Do they want to cash out? And if they want to cash out, then they'll sell it off, and it'll hit a portfolio of companies this PE group has, and then they'll change the setup. And so for me, I think it's going to evolve, especially on the for-profit front. I may have a client who doesn't want to, they want to keep growing steady growth, but then one day, one of the driving forces behind that company, which is what happened at our physician group, the driving force, my boss, he was done. He wanted to do other things, and nobody else was ready to step up, and nobody else had the ability to really do what he'd been doing. So if that driving force says, I'm done, I just want to cash out. So I think it's, PE sounds sexy and VC sounds sexy, but they change a business, sometimes not for the better, sometimes for the better. I'm not against them by any means, but they turn the screw a little bit further. They'll reduce expense, do what they can to increase revenue, but sometimes it's at the peril of the customer service at the other end. And I can say that from an IT group that I used at Habitat, and then at the physician practice, they got bought out and their service went downhill. And I'm in touch with the owner who started that business, and he's now going to do it again. He's going to go all over again. But there's a purpose for it and a place, but the business landscape, I think, is just going to keep changing.
Do you think business owners are going to find it harder, even if they want to stay independent, to be able to do that and compete? Because the PEs, they've got sort of the buying scale to squeeze them out and out-compete?
Depends on what they do, and how long they've been in it. So I think professional services groups probably aren't at the same risk, because you're not hiring a company to buy the product that anybody can produce. You're hiring their manpower, right? You're hiring that architect, or you're hiring that attorney, and you've built a relationship in that city, and you can't really replicate that. Now, for a physician group, it just gets incredibly difficult to run. They're very low margin. You got to get high volume, and most people just don't want to deal with it, and so they join another group so they don't have to deal with the billing. They don't have to deal with staffing. So as long as you've got good people, a good HR person to run your staff, you've got a good finance person to make sure your business is running well, you can do it, and you're not at risk of being out competed, I don't think. But there are going to be some industries that, they're going to come in and they're going to invest in a tool or a technology that then they can drop down, and then there's an ROI in 10 years, but they can drop down the cost. So for some, it'll happen for sure.
Well, great. Mathew, I want to be the first one to thank you for sharing your story with us today. Really
Awesome.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, it was fun. I appreciate it.
That's a wrap on another episode of the Inspired Stories podcast. Thanks for learning with us today.